maybe a way to sort of, all that has helped make this existential jump from startups to the conversation we're about to have. You know, we all celebrate startups who start from scratch. We all celebrate the charismatic single entrepreneurs, but I actually think there's a place in our hearts for those who are entrepreneurs within existing institutions. Corporate entrepreneurs who are trying to bring change into organizations that are a bit sclerotic. And the greatest heroes of all, I think, sometimes are the public service entrepreneurs who sacrifice the big jobs in the nice salaries and compensation area to come back to an organization whose permanence and stability is vital to our society. And that, I think, in many ways describes you. When you became Director General of RTE, I was reading some of the things, there was a quote that I kept coming back to where you said about trying to get people to adjust to the situation where the only constant is change. You said, we know what happens when we stay static and the world moves. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think that very notion, Mark, is the topic of our time. And I suppose having grown up in the media in London with Young and Rubicam advertising, then Turner Broadcasting, and then Discovery, I think I spent my life working with organizations who had incredibly clear purposes and yet had to evolve as time went on. And I suppose that's something that's sort of in my DNA. I'm a great believer in constantly challenging yourself and reinventing, but obviously keeping the principles and the values that what guide you as the permanent piece. And I think in the world we're in right now, and particularly for us in the media, that has never been so important. And it's something that we grapple with every day. But I do think, and we've been talking at RTE a lot about this, is there are a generation growing up now who have no idea of what the norm is. I think our generation have felt it and are feeling it constantly. And I think we're juggling, as to how we maintain a balance in a world where nothing is stable. And that is absolutely what we're grappling with. Now, I think what comes from a situation like that, while it brings incredible uncertainty, it also can bring incredible opportunity. And that's what I want for RTE. I want RTE to be there for that next generation. I want people to interact, embrace, discuss with RTE. Yes, in different ways than you and I would have done as we grew up. But I think in the world we're in right now, the need for independent public voice has never been more crucial. And that's the job I'm here to do, to ensure that we are here for that. Does that mean we have to change? Yes. Are we changing? Yes, we are every day. And for me, it's a constant journey because the world of media, as we've just been hearing, is evolving, is constant. There is no such thing as what was okay on Monday is okay by Friday. That's just the world we're in. So, for me, it's the very, I suppose, premise of what I'm doing at RTE is that nothing is the same. However, there are some very fundamental principles, but the actual business of the media has changed beyond recognition, and we have to work with that.
But I also think values play such an important role, and our personalities are key to forming our values. So let me take you back on your journey, because I think we're about the same age. I think we grew up in the same kind of Ireland, 70s, 80s, I'm guessing.
Yeah,
let me take you back to Drumaleague. Like, I'm just looking back now to your 10-year-old self. Did you dream of being a media executive when you were that age, when you were thinking about looking at from West Cork at the world? What did you want to be? What role did you want to play?
Gosh, the 10-year-old me. I grew up in West Cork, fabulous spot. I hope you all know it. Life was very simple when I think back to those days. You got up, you went to school, I came home for lunch. The radio was always on in the kitchen. My parents ran a pub, Mum was in the bar working, Dad was at school teaching. I was surrounded by fabulous family, friends, and I grew up in a very, for me, a very interesting environment because everyone around me worked. My grandmothers, my aunts, so it was a very happy childhood and one that, as I say, for me was simple, but it was filled with possibilities. And I suppose, again, looking back, nothing was impossible, and I was brought up that way. My dad, being a teacher, education was hugely impossible, made do our homework, do all those things like we all have to do. But everything was possible, and the mentality from both Mum, Dad, and those around me was, you can do whatever you want to do, but you've got to work for it. So this ethic of hard work, I think, was ingrained in me from an early age, whether that was my homework or working in the pub. So I suppose I grew up with that, and for me it was like, great, well, I can do whatever I want to be. And the rest
And what
is
you
history.
went to do was 1989, I think you left. Was
Yeah.
that a choice, or was that just you didn't feel it was possible to be what you wanted to be in Dublin at the time?
Yeah, well, I guess I graduated in '88 from UCD, and it was a very different world. I knew I wanted to get into advertising in some way because I was very involved in college life, raising money and putting together newsletters and all of that. And I loved the interaction actually with brands and knocking a path to the Bank of Ireland or AIB or Heineken to get money for a ball or a project or whatever. So I loved all that, and I recognized at that stage the importance of the brand and affinity for that. So, Dublin in 1988, 89 was not a good place. And I was very fortunate that a friend of the family was the head of CDP advertising here in Dublin, a huge agency and a global agency. So I spent a week with Bob in the agency, and he said, look, go around, sample agency life, have a little bit of time in the creative team, the account team, the media team. I didn't know what any of this meant at the time, but I spent a few days in each, and I came away going, gosh, this is a great business, I love it. You're working with amazing brands, you're working with clients, and I said to myself, okay, I'd love to sort of go into the account management area. So account management in an ad agency is the suit, effectively. It's the Don Draper, if you remember Mad Men. It's the link between the client and the agency, and I just thought I'd love that. And Bob said to me very clearly, there is no work in Ireland. I will write to all of my contacts in London, and the rest is up to you. So I did that.
You joined Young and Rubicam.
I joined Young and Rubicam.
And is that where someone said to you, the future is not advertising, it's media?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I went knocking on all the doors, everyone saw me, and I met the then chairman of Young and Rubicam, John Banks, fabulous man. And he was sitting on this big sixth floor office in a real advertising agency world. And I said, I want to be an account person. He said, why? I said, because I'd like to be that link between agency and client. And he said, well, in my mind, the future is media. And if I were you, I'd go and talk to Don Sperring, the head of media, and go from there. And the rest is history. So.
And history takes you to Turner.
Turner, yep.
Did you have an interaction with Ted Turner himself? Did you find him to be someone who was important in your career?
Absolutely. Again, I think, I look back, Turner Broadcasting arrived in London at the time the cable and satellite revolution was starting. Sky had just launched, and Ted brought his ambition from the US around the world. And, Ted had this great vision that if you have great content, you can then build a business. So Ted's whole philosophy was he bought the library, the old Hanna-Barbera library and the MGM library. He then in the States bought up the local cable networks to create a national cable system. He launched CNN, and then he went overseas. And, again, a very, very, a visionary and inspirational individual who had a very clear mission and vision. And I got to work with Ted on a number of occasions because I ran the sales team. That's how I started out in the broadcast world. And Ted loved everybody who handled the money because that was his background.
He used to say, I think, money's the way you keep count or something like that.
Absolutely. And he had this phrase as well, early to bed, early to rise, make lots of money and don't forget to advertise. That was his sort of, 3 or 4 lines. And he would say this everywhere you'd go with him to a client.
God, the old days.
They were brilliant, absolutely. So Ted, I was basically a mid-level executive, but every time he came to London, he would seek me out, he would want to know what was happening in the business, he would come and see a few clients, and they loved him. Charismatic.
So you step up out of Turner, you're now in Discovery Networks.
Yeah.
As I understand, 27 brands, you're responsible for 14 countries eventually?
Yeah.
Like, that is a Tower of Babel. I mean, tell us about that. Is it an immersion in challenges? Tell me.
It was, Turner, I loved Turner, first of all, because I grew up in Turner Broadcasting, and I grew up with incredible brands like Cartoon Network, Turner Classic Movies, and CNN. I mean, phenomenal brands at a time when the world was changing. The media environment was changing, and advertisers were getting new opportunities, new content opportunities were emerging, and the whole, I suppose, arrival of digital meant that Turner's products could be all over Europe and the world. So Discovery for me was another passion project because I love the brand. And I've always worked for brands, fortunately, that I really, really like. So Discovery, when I joined, a huge, huge giant in the sort of factual world. But again, a company that wasn't able to afford to stand still. So as I joined Discovery, a lot of thinking at Discovery about how do we move from being a cable and satellite factual company to being a real multi-content, multi-platform player. And at the time, we went through the acquisition of Eurosport. We bid on the Olympic rights, which was phenomenal at the time. We launched free-to-air networks around Italy, Spain. We bought huge companies in the Nordics. And again, that's a great example, I think, of a company whose DNA was about factual content and cable and satellite. And it transformed itself to be a media agnostic or a platform agnostic player because it recognized that to be a player for the next 20, 50 years, it had to evolve. So that was a huge
You could have been in
experience.
the driving seat for the next 20, 50 years. And then along comes RTE. Like, at one level, I know you kept contact with Ireland. You were traveling back to Glandore, I believe,
Yep.
during time of Discovery.
Yep.
But this job opening comes and you're thinking to yourself, are you thinking, why should I not do this? Or why should I do it? What's going through your head when you see that opening?
I suppose for me, when working in the media, I always looked at RTE, very favorably, sometimes critically, but also, I suppose, in the back of my mind, having been in London, for 27 years, in one hand, I never thought I would come home, and I suppose deep down, I thought, well, maybe if I ever do go back, maybe it will be RTE. But like everybody, I thought, oh, that'll be when I get older, and that'll never happen. So I suppose for me, it was maybe the time was right. I had an amazing 27 years in London. The opportunity came up, and I thought, this is a good time. I've loved my time in London. I've learned a lot, and I hope that what I could do is bring some of what I've learned to my new role.
And you make history in that new role. You're the first outside appointment for donkey's years.
Correct,
You're the first woman to lead
Yeah.
RTE. And I'm thinking when you get in there and this is you're basking in the initial sort of excitement of the job, is there a moment of like, holy shit, there's something so big here I can't solve? Is there a moment when you go, oh my God, this is a bigger challenge than I thought?
Look, I think, I came into it eyes wide open, and I knew a lot of the background, I knew a lot of the challenge, but again, being very honest with you, you never know the extent of any organization until you get into it. And I think, I spent the first 6 months trying to understand the organization, get my head under the bonnet, get to know the people, and the challenges, to be really honest, are very similar to many other media organizations. They're just the same challenges, different country. But also, I suppose, for RTE, it's a very different challenge in the sense that RTE is huge in the Irish context. So too is the BBC in the UK. But I think, RTE was the only game in town for an awful long time. Then along came, Sky, TV3, now Virgin Media, etc. So I think there's an awful lot of legacy with RTE, some good, some not so good. And that is something that, you have to recognize, but then, move on and take the good bits, leave some of the bad bits behind and move forward. So, there's no doubt it is a huge challenge, but any media organization right now is. And also, I think it's important to say that, RTE wouldn't have been around for the last 50 years if it wasn't doing something right. And, RTE does an awful lot of things right. It has great affection with the public. It has great, empathy. It has great, creative ability. And, what we're now facing is, obviously, we have to keep what's good about that, but move on. And how we remain relevant for me, is our biggest question.
And one of the biggest challenges I thought you took on was trying to define a one RTE, because when I worked there, it was kind of competing republics, and I think this to some extent always was. And you've this strategy that has kind of three core goals, and I'm just interested in the first one about audiences first, and that's audiences plural, right? So
Yep.
there's clearly, from when we were growing up in Ireland to now, multiple age groups, ethnic backgrounds, gender. I mean, the diversity of Ireland is quite a phenomenal challenge in itself. Why audiences first?
Okay. If you think about our purpose, why is RTE there? We're there to serve the Irish people. And the Irish people is our audience. And if we don't understand and know what the Irish public expect from us and want from us, then it doesn't matter how we're structured or how we operate technologically. It will go absolutely nowhere if we don't understand the audience.
But they speak in so many different voices these days, from the 18-year-old to the 65-year-old. Mm-hmm. Just even those demographic terms.
Yeah. And again, I suppose television, radio, we have lots of numbers. And I think what we have to do is we have to take what we would typically have called research and create insight from that research. And on top of that, to your point of the diversity of the audience, we have to do a lot more out and about talking to the audience and not just rely on, regular, data-driven numbers. And for me, it's about really understanding, okay, what's the difference between an 80-year-old and a 45 or a 50-year-old? There's huge difference in what they want and what they expect. Can RTE deliver all that they expect all the time? No. But we have to really find, for me, the touch points that will resonate with them. It won't be all of the content all of the time. That's not possible. But what's appealing to an 18-year-old? And you look at things like comedy, for example, current affairs more and more as well. And you sort of then begin to sort of shape a strategy that can target the younger audiences, while of course you will get the older anyway.
And internally, how do you restructure an organization to make it look like your audiences, to bring in voices that have not been heard, to be more diverse in every single way? Internally, what kind of challenges?
Okay, well that's a big challenge for an organization that isn't able to do a lot of recruitment. We are, and we haven't been able to do a lot of what I would call recruiting over the last number of years, in terms of new blood and new faces. However, I think what we are doing is we are reinvigorating some internal talent. So, for example, this whole notion of one RTE, what that means is instead of having teams dedicated to television, radio, and digital, we now have teams that work across every platform. So we have a team, for example, in arts and culture. That's what they're focused on, but they work across every platform. So their question is, what audience do I want to serve? And then they decide the platform to serve it from.
Which is part of your second goal as well,
exactly.
about how the audience connects. It's when, how, and where.
Yeah.
You're adjusting your mindset around that as well.
Yeah, and I think just back to the point about the structure piece. For me, there is a huge amount of emphasis needs to go on structure in an organization like ours, because we're a legacy media organization, and we need to spend as much time on the structures that we have as well as restructuring the content, because if we don't get that right, we won't satisfy the content need. And this new structure is it's generating some fantastic ideas. And we're not thinking about just one piece of content that is for radio or for telly or for digital. We're thinking, okay, maybe the origin is for a slot on radio and television, but what else can we do around the organization to amplify that content? And whether that's about creating a franchise like The Big Picture, which we've created to be a cross-organizational opportunity, which tackles a very big subject like homelessness, and we will then run it for a week across RT on all our platforms. And it's actually giving internal people great opportunity, and it's making the organization think like, gosh, the combined impact is greater than the individual, and that's really strong.
And I think the aspiration to the third pillar about quality content, right? But I always had a contradiction about RT, even working there. On the one hand, we knew our public service remit. We had to judge it on its social impact or public impact. But we were also up against Champions League on the other channel. We had a commercial mandate in which quality was something different. It was about ratings. Is there not still a contradiction about how you score the quality of content, whether it's public service or it does well in the ratings?
That, I think, for us is always going to be a question. You know, we have, as you say, an obligation to be public service, but we're also to then optimize that for commercial benefit. And that's a good thing, actually, because I think it keeps us on our toes, and it makes sure also that we have that, I suppose, balance in our offering. And I think, you know, we also have to think about the audience here. And, you know, the whole vision for public service broadcasting is, you know, it's to educate, inform, and entertain. So let's not think that public service broadcasting is all broccoli. You know, there is some other nice things going with it.
Yeah,
so
but you're
the audience need balance.
But you're competing against global platforms that are just all about cake, right? They don't care about broccoli. How do you maintain any kind of competitive advantage against the Netflixes and the TikToks even, if you're thinking in broader terms?
Yeah, I think, you know, the competition is vast and it's fantastic. You know, it's great to have, you know, plenty of opportunity and I think for viewers that never had more opportunity. For us, I think it's all about being Irish. And, you know, we're here to serve the Irish public with great Irish content. And whether that's a broccoli version or a cake version, you know, I don't really mind because that's what we're here to do. And I also think that the ability within Ireland and within, you know, our producers, directors, actors, there are great stories there that can stand up right against those competition and offer viewers that choice when they want to have it. The other thing is that right now we're in a world of on-demand, and again, we can't ignore that. And, you know, people need to know that they can watch what they want, when they want, wherever it is. So again, for us to have that, I would say, variety of content in a player environment is hugely important, so that people can choose the broccoli or the cake. And it means that we make sure that we have both in that environment.
Well, back in the old days where I have someone in my ear saying, wrap it all up, and I think we're going over. But I wanted to get into your other interest in entrepreneurship, I know, in Cork. You're also on the board of Munster Rugby, which I know is a tough station to have. Good luck tomorrow, by the way, against Munster. And I'm supposed to ask you this question, I suppose, at the end where I say, what does RT look like in 10 years? And I'm not going to ask it. I think it's kind of a ridiculous question. But I will ask this. What's the thing that keeps you awake at night? The problem you think the station has to solve over the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay. I think the challenge for us is relevance and ensuring that in our quest for relevance with the younger generation and the new generation coming through, that we also, you know, deliver and I suppose nurture a great creative environment. That's what it's all about. You know, we're not making widgets. We're making great content to serve the Irish public. And for me, you know, it's never been more challenging, but never more exciting either. So for me, you know, ensuring that, you know, the relevance is the challenge, but I think we have plenty of ammunition in our tank to get there and to fight for it. Will it be easy? No, but hey, who wants an easy life?
Well, it's a great way to end. I don't think we can all agree that we've never need public service media more than we do today. And very best of luck. I think it's where I say that's all we have time for. Thanks very much, Dee Forbes.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.